Everybody, welcome aboard. We're excited to be here tonight with evangelist Tim Keyes. He's a book author, researcher, internet evangelist. I want to thank Dr. Del Sides for introducing us, and we've got the next hour together. Brother Tim, do you want to open us up in prayer?
Sure, absolutely. Heavenly Father, in the name of Jesus Christ, we give you the glory and the honor and the praise that rightfully belongs to you and to you alone. Father, thank you for this time that we have to spend together, even though it's on the internet. What a great opportunity for all of us to gather together around your word, and may the power of your Holy Spirit quicken and enlighten us tonight to learn great things about you and being able to glorify you and live a life that is just exciting and full of your grace. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
I say amen to that. Brother Tim, welcome back. Glad to be here with you, and the microphone is yours.
Well, thank you, sir. I'm going to talk about something tonight that I'm hoping, interesting way to introduce it, that I'm hoping a lot of you, frankly, have never heard before. I think you've probably heard some of it, but you may not have heard all of it, and I am going to take you on a little bit of a history lesson before we dive back into the scriptures themselves. And what I want to talk about is that several thousand years ago, in ancient Mesopotamia, the way that information would be transmitted is they would use clay tablets. They would take clay and they would form either a rectangular or a circular clay tablet, and then they would take a triangular shaped stylus. In other words, it looks like a pencil, but the cross section is a triangle. And then by angling that stylus, they would make an impression in the soft clay. So if you can imagine angling that stylus and pressing it down, it would make a little triangular mark in the clay. And then by grouping these triangular marks together, that would form letters and words and things like that. And this is a type of text that is known as cuneiform. And cuneiform text was used to write many of the ancient Mesopotamian languages, Sumerian, Akkadian, and then later Babylonian and things like that. But it was these clay tablets that were used to record and then transmit information. So I want to talk about three particular clay tablets, two of which are on display at the British Museum in London, and then a third that is on display at the museum in Berlin. So the first one I talk about is the oldest one. Now, it was recovered from what is known as the Royal Library of Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire was one of the great ancient empires of the Middle East. Assyria was in northern Mesopotamia, so the capital was Nineveh. Nineveh corresponds to modern Mosul, Iraq, by the way, so most of us at least have an idea where that is because of the events of the past 20 and 30 years and the wars in Iraq. So modern Mosul, Iraq is where Nineveh was, and in the mid-1800s was when archaeology was discovered. Archaeology didn't really exist prior to that, but you had a lot of European explorers who were in the Middle East, and they were digging up these ancient areas and then finding stuff, and they began the art and the science that we now call archaeology. Now, they made a lot of mistakes along the way, especially with these clay tablets, because you can imagine if you've got a clay tablet that is a couple of thousand years old, it's dry and it's brittle, and you shove a shovel into the ground, you can actually break these clay tablets. So they probably lost as many clay tablets as they found initially until they learned the science of recovering these. But a very famous British archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard was instrumental in finding a lot of these clay tablets, and the one that we're speaking of, we believe, was recovered by him. And this one, the first one we're going to talk about, like I said, it's on display in the British Museum in London, and it's a circular tablet. It's about 7 inches in diameter. It has cuneiform writing on one side. It has a prescribed border around the edge, and then it's divided into 8 sections like a pie. Okay, now when it was recovered, it is believed that at the time it was written, this tablet had actually been damaged by fire. So about 40% of the tablet is actually blank. You can only read about 60% of it. But what's so important about this tablet is that it contains, it's astronomical in nature, and it includes diagrams and names of constellations. So as a result, this tablet, it's tablet K8538, but it has been dubbed the Planisphere, is what it's called when you go visit the British Museum. Now, likely, this tablet was written in about 700 BC. Like I said, it was recovered in the middle of the 19th century, but it was probably written about 700 BC. And it was written in cuneiform text, but the language is Sumerian. Now, the reason this is interesting is because we're going to encounter a concept here that is still used today, which is that it was likely written in Sumerian because even when it was written, Sumerian was already a dead language. And the reason we use dead languages for documents sometimes, it's done in the fields of medicine, it's done in the field of law, and it's certainly understood in the biblical field, is if you're using a dead language, you do not run the risk of the definitions of words changing. Right? If it's a dead language, you know that a certain word means a certain thing. So it's very interesting that this disc, this tablet, this round tablet, was written in Sumerian, because what I'm driving at here is that this disc was a copy. Okay, so it was likely written down or copied in about 700 BC, but it was copied from a much older tablet, a much older tablet. So this was something that they would do, is that they would write, quote unquote, on these tablets, and then they'd get their tablets together and they would transmit the information to other tablets for, quote unquote, kind of permanent storage, right? But there's a very, very, there's some very unique features about this tablet, because when these tablets, and we're going to talk about this in all 3 tablets I want to mention tonight, they are astronomical in nature, so they record the placement of stars. So whenever you're looking at an ancient text like this that records the placement of stars, these texts, they date themselves, because with our modern technology, we can read the text and go, oh, well, it's telling us that the stars and the planets were here, here, and here, and we can plug that in a computer and wind the clock backwards, so to speak, and we are able to pinpoint when that happened from the description on the disk. So I'm going to tell you the date of this disc here in just a second, but I want to tell you one other feature of this disc that is really interesting, which is that this disc lists stars and diagrams that exist at less than what is known as NEO magnitude. Now, NEO magnitude means naked eye observation. So it records stars that are at less than naked eye observation. So you have to ask yourself, okay, how is this possible, and what did they know that we didn't know, that if they were able to accurately record the positions of stars, that they couldn't see? Very, very, very interesting. But a detailed examination of this text and the features of the tablet indicate that this is a copy of a text that is dated from, ready, the 4th millennium BC. Okay, so the fourth millennium, not fourth century, fourth millennium, it means this text is older than 3000 BC. Very, very, very provocative. So we do not know whether the copyist, in other words, the scribe who was copying this text, because he may simply have been that. He may simply have been a copyist, right? Moving the marks from one tablet to another. We don't know whether he understood what he was copying, but someone who wrote this down understood what they were looking at, and it's really provocative that even at 700 BC, let alone 3000 BC, that this clay tablet records what is known as the precession of the equinoxes, and that means that they knew about the precession of the equinox 500 years before the Greek astronomer Hipparchus is the one who is credited with having found that. But the point being here is that this clay tablet records a summer night sky in 3123 BC. It is really, really, really old, and it is an accurate astronomical diagram. Now, another couple of points about this particular tablet, and then we're going to move to the next one. If they did not dry these tablets in the sun, this is really interesting. If they did not dry these tablets in the sun, one of the things we have learned is that they would use water and then like a rag or a sponge to erase the text and reconstitute the clay and then reuse the tablet. So this has given rise to the hypothesis that these round 6 to 7 inch tablets, they were like a field record. So in other words, they were the notebook of the day. And you'll come to understand this more as I proceed through tonight's sharing what these were used for. But they were essentially a notebook. And then what they do is later on, they would gather up the smaller circular tablets, and then they would transfer the information to larger tablets that would then be dried. Okay, and another reason that the professionals in this field believe that these were reused is because we actually don't have a super lot of the round ones. We've got a lot of the other ones, but we don't have a lot of the round ones, and they believe this is because they were reused and then eventually, frankly, disposed. Okay, but it's very provocative, therefore, to recognize that whatever was recorded on this one was preserved and copied. They went through a lot of, they took the care and the time to transfer this from one tablet to another and preserve it. So if what I'm saying is all accurate and correct, because this isn't an absolutely exact science yet, this means that the ancient Sumerians possessed a very sophisticated and advanced understanding of astronomy in earlier than 3000 BC. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to fast forward to the middle of the second millennium BC, so roughly about 1600 BC, and we're going to talk about another clay tablet, a different clay tablet. Now, this is another tablet that is on display at the British Museum in London, and this one is known as the Venus Tablet of Ammisaduqa. Now, the reason it's called that is because it is a catalog of what is known as the helical risings of the planet Venus. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. So it's the Venus Tablet of Ammisaduqa, and then Ammisaduqa is the Babylonian king that reigned at that time. And just like the first tablet, because this is astronomical in nature, we can read the content of the tablet, translate it, and then plug the coordinates, frankly, into a computer and realize that, oh my word, this is a catalog of a 21-year period of time in the middle of the 17th century BC when King Misaduca was reigning in Babylon. And like I said, it is a catalog of the helical risings of the planet Venus. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Now, the Venus Tablet of Ammisaduqa is part of a larger collection. It is actually tablet number 63 of, I think it's 72 tablets that record what is known as the Enuma, Anu, and Enlil, which is the Babylonian astrological omen text. What they did is they recorded all these. They not only recorded the charts and the sightings and the positions, but then they would interpret the positions of the stars, and then they would write down what they believed this interpretation was, and we call that an omen. Now, the word omen sometimes has a negative connotation. I'm not using it that way. I'm simply using the word omen here to mean an interpretation of the positions of the stars. And then this tablet is also recovered from the library at Nineveh, and it's small as well. It's only about 3.5 inches wide and about 7 inches long, which means that the text on these things is very small. It's really interesting how small the text is. Now, this one again is very similar here. The copy that we have is probably from right around 700 BC, so that means it is a copy of an older text that was transferred to the new tablet. So once again, this is really, really interesting that now you have a very, very accurate, hyper accurate astronomical text written in the middle of the 17th century BC that is a record of the helical risings of Venus. Now, what is that? What does that mean? What am I talking about? And helical rising, it comes from the Greek word helios, which is the Greek word for the sun. So a helical rising is when a planet pops up over the horizon right about the same time that the sun is rising. And then depending upon the exact position of the planet in relationship to the sun, that determines, number one, whether you can even see the planet or not, because sometimes the planet is completely hidden by the brightness of the sun. But then because of the orbits, the rotation of the Earth, and then the orbits of the planets, and then the orbit of the Earth around the sun, and all these different things, all the geometry of this all working together, what will happen is that the star will pop up above the horizon just before the sun's brightness blanks it out and you can't see it. So when it first pops up over the horizon, they might only see it for a matter of seconds. It might only be up there for 10 or 20 or 30 or 60 seconds before the sun blanks it out and you can't see it anymore. But this is what is known as a helical rising, and then you also have what is known as a helical setting. So that it's kind of the opposite in a way, which is when the sun is going down in the west and the star is above the horizon. As the sun dips below the horizon and it starts to get a little bit darker, a little bit darker, a little bit darker, finally you are able to actually see that star. So that is what is known as a helical setting. So the Venus Tablet of Ammisaduqa is a catalog of a 21-year period of time in the middle of the 17th century BC that records the helical risings of the planet Venus. Okay, so here we go again. Now, and what I want to point out is the helical risings and then also the meticulousness of both of these tablets that you clearly have in existence in ancient Mesopotamia, an elite class of highly educated, highly meticulous celestial observer. Okay, so now let's fast forward again. All right, now we're going to fast forward to and talk about this third tablet. Now this tablet is in the Berlin Museum, and this tablet is labeled VAT 4956. And this one also is astronomical in nature. It details the position of the moon and the planets during the 37th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Now that's a name that any bibliophile is going to recognize. If you're a Bible head, you know the name Nebuchadnezzar. Now the two tablets I've talked about already, that may not mean a whole lot, but all of a sudden I'm dropping the name Nebuchadnezzar. This is a clay tablet that records lunar and planetary positions during year 37 of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And then in addition, there is text in this clay tablet, and this text, which means that this was written in 567 BC. We know the date it was written because of the position of the stars. It was written in 567 BC, and this tablet confirms, ready? This tablet confirms the second conquest of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. Okay? Slow down and think about what I just said. Nebuchadnezzar conquered Babylon first in 605 BC, and then he did it again in 586 BC. And this is an independent verification of what we know biblically as the second conquest of Jerusalem. So, and it includes detailed celestial observation. So it verifies the date of when the text was written, and it verifies the date of when Jerusalem was conquered for the second time. Now, for a Bible head, what we need to do is we need to go look at Jeremiah chapter 39. And in Jeremiah chapter 39, in the first 3 verses, we read about this second conquest of Jerusalem. And it says, in the 9th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army came against Jerusalem and besieged it. In the 11th year of Zedekiah, in the 4th month, on the 9th day of the month, the city was penetrated. Then all the princes of the king of Babylon came in and sat in the middle gate. And then we get a bunch of names and titles that I'm going to talk about in a second. But this is something, again, that most of us should be familiar with, that when you conquered a city, the officials would come in and they would sit in the gate. Right? Because the gate was the position of authority. So if you came in and you sat in the gate, it means you're in control, right? So now it gives you some names and some titles. So the first name it gives you is Nergal-Sharezer. The second name is Samgar-Nebo. And then the third name is Sarsekim. And then we are given his title, which is Rabsaris. Okay, then the fourth name is Nergal-Sharezer, and then we are given his title, which is Rabmag. So if you're reading along with me, Nergal-Sharezer, first name, Samgar-Nebo, second name, Sarsekim the Rabsaris, and then Nergal-Sharezer the Rabmag. Those are titles. And you'll notice the prefix Rab, R-A-B, in both of these titles. That's because the Hebrew prefix Rab, R-A-B, means head or chief. Okay, so the Rabsaris is the chief of the eunuchs. A saris is a eunuch, right? So Sarsekim is the chief of the eunuchs, and then Nergal-Sharezer is the chief of the Mag, or the Magi. He is the chief of the Magi. And I'm going to fast forward for just a second here and come back, because when we get to the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 2, and we're reading about the birth of Christ, or actually what is by this point about 15 months after the birth of Christ, we are told that wise men from the east came to the court of Herod the Great in Jerusalem and said, "Where is he who was born King of the Jews?" Well, in Greek, the word for wise men is magoi, or magi. And when Matthew wrote this, he doesn't explain, not even for 1 second, who these guys are. He presumes that his reading audience knows who these guys are. They know what a magi is, and therefore he just says, yeah, wise men from the east came to the court of Herod the Great saying, "Where is he who was born King of the Jews?" So now dial back again to our third tablet here, because our third tablet, like I said, it records the second conquest of Jerusalem, and then we have the parallel record in Jeremiah 39 that tells us some of the officials of the Babylonian court and the Babylonian army that were present in the gate, and that one of them is the Rabmag Nergal-Sharezer. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that he is the chief of the Magi, but he is a chief or a head of the Magi. So now, let's start to put this together, because this is a lot of information that's extremely provocative, but I have demonstrated that we have 3 celestial clay tablets, one as old as 3000 BC, another from 1600 BC, and now a third one from 567 BC, that are all astronomical in nature. And what this tells us is that the Babylonians, the Mesopotamians, this was a big deal. This was a really, really, really big deal to them, that they were meticulous in celestial observation and recording what they saw. So over the years now, we have recovered tens of thousands of clay tablets. I mean, there's like 30,000 clay tablets have been recovered from the Royal Library at Nineveh alone, let alone the Royal Library at Babylon or the Royal Library at Sippar or any of these other cities in ancient Mesopotamia where these tablets would have been written. And when we try to study these very enigmatic wise men that are listed in the Gospel of Matthew, it's really difficult to find information, quote unquote, written about them. Like, for example, pardon me, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote very briefly about the Magi, but he didn't actually write about them in glowing terms. So therefore, it's like, okay, well, there's one record that we can learn a little bit about them, but it's from someone who obviously didn't really care for them very much, so can we trust the accuracy? But the reason I'm bringing this up is because I'm just going to get to the punchline here. It was the Magi who made the clay tablets. So we actually have a ton of information about these men, but it's internal information. It's not external. It's internal. It's from the information that they wrote down themselves. Okay? Now, 35 years ago, when I began my research into the Nativity, at that time, maybe 10% of these tablets had been translated, if we're lucky. If we're lucky, maybe 10%. But now, 35 years later, that's how long I've been working on this project. Now we're something up where in the neighborhood of about 30% of the tablets have been translated, okay? Now, what has also happened, however, is something very curious. Very, very, very curious, which is that the experts, the men and women who can read cuneiform text and who can translate this, because this is very difficult work, very, very difficult to translate cuneiform text. What they have obviously done is that they have obviously gone through the tablets and read, quote unquote, the first sentence or the first paragraph or something like that, because then what they did is they used this to determine which tablets they would translate and which ones they wouldn't. In other words, how they would prioritize which tablets they would translate next. And evidently, what they discovered is that somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% of these clay tablets are astronomical in nature. Okay, let me repeat that. 70% of these clay tablets are astronomical in nature. And as a result, this is what's weird about this. This is what is strange, is that as a result, the experts that can actually do the translation said, you know what? Let's translate the other texts. We don't really care about astronomy. We don't really care about astrology, because that's all hooky pook, weird stuff. And, we're scientists and we're into things that can be proven, and we don't want to talk about that stuff. So they ignored it because, like I said, about 75% of these are astronomical in nature, and they actually recorded the interpretations, not only the positions and locations, but then they would record the omens themselves. And they've actually translated enough of these now that you can actually buy a catalog of the omens that the Mesopotamian Magi used, frankly, to give a daily intelligence briefing to the king. That was their job. I have one of these. One of these books in my stack right here behind me for all the work I've done on nativity. That I have one of these catalogs now of letters written to Assyrian and Babylonian kings that are the daily intelligence briefing of the Magi to the king, because the Magi they weren't just astronomers. They were truly wise men. They did a lot of things. They were responsible for the hard sciences of the day. So turns out they had really amazing mathematics. We know this, frankly, because of their astronomy, because they didn't have a lot of the technology that we have, so they did it all using math. And if they discovered what they discovered using math, they were pretty extraordinary. But they taught math, they taught history, they taught medicine. They also were in charge of dream interpretation. That was a big deal back then in these ancient cultures. And they also oversaw royal succession. And what that means, very briefly here, is that when the king of the realm would die, it was the Magi who helped determine who the next king would be. So by the time we get up closer to the birth of Christ, for example, and we're looking at the Parthian king, Phraates IV, Phraates IV died in 2 BC, and then the Magi showed up at the court of Herod the Great in very late 2 BC. So isn't that provocative that we now can understand that the Parthian Magi were looking for the new king, not just of the Jews, but potentially the new king of Parthia, because their king had just died, and that's what they do. But isn't it provocative that the experts, so to speak, they kind of set these aside for a minute. They didn't really want to deal with the astronomical text. They wanted the mathematical text and the history texts and stuff like that. But now they have finally gotten around to translating a lot of these astronomical texts, and we are learning so much about who these men were, what they did, how they worked, and things like that. And this is really helping our understanding of this very enigmatic record in Matthew 2, where it says, and wise men from the east apparently just showed up. Right? Now, I think there's more to it than that. In my research, I've really delved into understanding who these men were, and I think Herod did have advanced notice by a day or two that they were showing up, because this was an official ambassadorial entourage that showed up at his court, not 3 guys on camels. Sorry, guys. Hate to burst the bubble on the tradition there, but it wasn't just 3 guys on camels. It was an official ambassadorial entourage with military escort, because they were traveling into Roman territory. Judea was a client kingdom of the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire at that time. The Romans and the Parthians, were enemies. They were at war. So there is no way the Magi would have traveled into, quote unquote, enemy territory without military escort. But I want to dial it back here for a second. I want to go back to about 600 BC, roughly, and look at the Babylonian captivity for a second, because I mentioned in Jeremiah 39 the second conquest of Jerusalem. There was a first and there was a third. And during the first conquest of Jerusalem, and it happened during all the conquests, but during the first conquest of Jerusalem was when the Babylonians took a whole bunch of Hebrew captives and brought them back to the Babylonian court, and they would select the best and the brightest of these Judean captives, quote unquote, and they would train them to work in the Babylonian court, because an educated man was an educated man. Okay, that was a valuable thing. So even though they were, quote unquote, captives, nonetheless, you would train them to be court officials and work in your court. And most of us know the story of Daniel chapter 2, where Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and Nebuchadnezzar puts the word out that he wants, here you go. See, they're in charge of dream interpretation, like we said. Nebuchadnezzar puts the word out that he wants the wise men to interpret his dream and tell him what it means, and they can't do it. And then he gets very upset and says, oh yeah, by the way here, if you can't interpret this, off with your head. Okay, now apparently Daniel and his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, okay, that we know more by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were in this category. They were being trained to operate in the same system and as, here we go, as wise men, as magi, because their lives were on the line as well. And then we learn from the story that Daniel spoke to the king and said, hey, give us some time. He went to the captain of the guard and said, give us some time so that we can seek God and discover the interpretation of the dream. And then we know the story. Daniel receives the revelation and then interprets the dream for Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar falls prostrate before Daniel and says, truly the Spirit of the living God is in you. And it says that he promotes Daniel to be the chief of the wise men of Babylon. He is given the title. Now in Daniel chapter 2, that's in Aramaic, so he's called Rab Hakim instead of Rab Mag there, but they are equivalent words. Okay, he is made Rab Mag. He is made the chief of the Magi. So isn't this really interesting that now you have Judeans in the Babylonian court potentially receiving the information about astronomy from the Babylonians, but then also bringing what they know about astronomy? Because in all of these ancient cultures, and this is very important, in all of these ancient cultures, astronomy was a part of daily life. We don't recognize this in our day and time because we are so far removed because of natural lighting that we are not familiar with the stars the way they would have back then. And we don't think that this, our modern quote-unquote enlightened culture, we don't think this matters. Ancient cultures, it was very, very, very different. They absolutely believed in astronomy and astrology in every major culture, including the Judeans. They had their form of what is known as archaeoastronomy. That's what ancient cultures knew and understood and believed about astronomy. The Judeans had it too. Now, clearly the Judeans got it from the one true God, not from quote-unquote, pagan sources. So those of us that have been in this field for a while, we have done a lot of research into what does Judean archaeoastronomy look like. And for those of you that might be familiar with this already, we can talk about Revelation chapter 12, verse 1, where we read, there was a great sign and wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon underneath her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And that is an astronomical sign. And there is a parallel sign given in Genesis chapter 49 in verse 10, where Jacob is prophesying over his sons, and he prophesies over Judah, and he says that, Judah is a lion's whelp. And then he says, and the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes. That is actually an astronomical sign as well, and they are both actually speaking about the same astronomical sign. But here is the key to understanding it. Revelation 12, the woman clothed with the sun, that is the constellation Virgo. Genesis 49, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, that is the constellation Leo. And here's the interesting part. You can't see both of them in the night sky at the same time. And the reason this becomes important is because the Babylonians would engage in a morning and an evening observation. They would go out in the morning when it was still dark, and they would wait until the sun came up, and they would record everything that they saw. And then at night, they'd do the same thing. They would go out before the sun set, and then as the sun sets, they would record everything they saw. So what would have happened is that the Genesis sign of the scepter not depart from Judah, that would have been visible during the morning observation, and then the woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, that would have been visible during the evening observation. But then because of the understanding, you would put it together in your head, and you would be able to understand that that is actually one sign. Records throughout that region for thousands of years, it stands to reason that there was somebody who understood what was going on. Now, not everybody, okay, because the Magi, they were highly educated. That doesn't mean that the shepherds, for example, knew what they were looking at. The Magi did, not necessarily the shepherds, but it's really stunning that we have this record right there in the night sky that is available to be read if you want to read it. But what I've just described to you is biblical astronomy, biblical archaeoastronomy, or Judean archaeoastronomy. But what did the Mesopotamians look for? What about their astronomy and astrology? What was important to them? And once again, from these ancient records, we can learn what they looked for and what they made a big deal about. And what they made a big deal about in order to be classified as an ancient astronomer, okay, there were 4 categories that they had to satisfy. And the 4 categories they had to satisfy was, number 1 was the fixed stars. So that means the constellations. They had to know the constellations, know their position, and which constellation would be in which part of the sky at which time of the year, right? So number 1, the fixed stars, the constellations. Number 2, they had to understand the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets. Now that means the 5 NEO planets, the naked eye observable planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Then category number 3 was they had to understand conjunctions and the phases of the moon, of the sun and the moon, and eclipses. So conjunctions, eclipses, and the phases of the sun and the moon. And then finally, category number 4 was risings and settings, in particular, helical risings and settings. Okay, so this was something that the Mesopotamian celestial observers would have paid extraordinary attention to. And that's why the tablets that I have mentioned are so provocative, because one of them, the Venus Tablet of Ammisaduqa, is a catalog of the helical risings of the planet Venus. Well, it stands to reason they likewise had a catalog of the helical risings of Jupiter. And that's what we're going to talk about here from now until we wrap this up in about 15 minutes, is the helical risings of the planet Jupiter, right? Because the planet Jupiter was known throughout classical antiquity as the king planet. It was the planet of royalty. It was the king planet. So frankly, just to be blunt about it, the Mesopotamian Magi were obsessed with the planet Jupiter and were obsessed with the helical risings of the planet Jupiter. They tracked the planet Jupiter every single day and wrote it down. Every single day and wrote it down. And therefore, again, using their math, right, they would know that, okay, it should, if the helical rising was on this date this year, we know that it should be on this date next year. But here's the key. They had to see it because of that whole thing of the fact that the star could be occluded by the sun. It actually had to be witnessed before it was official. The math would tell them, yeah, it should be on this day. But what actually had to happen is they had to go out in the morning and engage in the morning observation and then witness the heliacal rising of Jupiter. And then they would record it in the notebook of the day, which was one of these round clay tablets, and they would make the impressions in the cuneiform text, and then they would take it back and they would transfer it to a larger text. Okay, so this is something that would have happened, is you would have had officials going out every morning to look for, number one, just record what was happening every day, period, but especially to track the planet Jupiter. Okay, and this is really important because it is the heliacal rising of Jupiter is what is being spoken of in Matthew chapter 2. Because when the Magi showed up at the court of Herod the Great, they said, "We have seen his star Ente Anatole," which means in the rising. It's translated in the east, but it really means in the rising. And because they were fanatical about recording the heliacal risings of these planets, this is what they are speaking of. And part of the reason we know that is because if we fast forward to Matthew chapter 2, I think it's verse either 8 or 9, where we read about, it says, the star they saw in the rising went before them and stood over Bethlehem, where they were traveling to. This is another feature of the planet of Jupiter that the Mesopotamian Magi tracked on a daily basis. This is known as the stations of Jupiter, because there were several times during the year, because Jupiter would go into what is known as retrograde motion, that it would appear to stand still. So those dates and times were recorded explicitly and were called the stations of Jupiter. So this is very quickly getting to a place where it's not just coincidence that when these wise men showed up at the court of Herod the Great, that they said, "Oh yeah, by the way, we have seen his star in the rising." That is something that they would have been very meticulous about. And then when Herod sends them to Bethlehem and they're headed due south, it says that the same star came and stood over. Well, that's the stations of Jupiter, right? And that is something they would have been very meticulous about. And here we go. So now we're getting to the punchline. The punchline is that we can use modern computer technology and we can tell you the dates that these things happened. And that's what makes this so extraordinary, because those of us that have been in this field for a while, we've already identified that Revelation 12, verse 1, the woman clothed with the sun and the moon underneath her feet, and on her head the crown of 12 stars, combined with Genesis 49:10, that occurred in the morning and evening observation of September 11th in 3 BC. And because the shepherds were keeping watch of their flock by night, and it was the shepherds who went and found the baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger, we know that Jesus was born in the evening. So it would have been right about the time of the evening observation that Jesus was being born, as the sun was setting and the woman is clothed with the sun and the moon is under her feet. So somewhere right about 7 p.m. on September 11th, 3 BC is when Jesus was born. But when the wise men showed up at the court of Herod, they said, "We have seen his star in the rising." They're not talking about the woman clothed with the sun. They're talking about something they were familiar with. The woman clothed with the sun, that's Judean archaeoastronomy. The Mesopotamian Magi were looking for their form of astronomy, and it's very interesting that God communicated to them in this way, because the heliacal rising of Jupiter in 3 BC occurred on July 29th of 3 BC. So only a couple months before they had been tipped off to the birth of the Messiah of Israel. Because when Herod questions them, Herod includes a chronological component in that. He inquires of them and says, exactly what time did that star appear, and they would have been able to say it occurred on this date at this time, and that's why Herod set the slaughter of the innocents based upon the timing that the Magi said. But what's really provocative about this is that it lines up exactly with what should have happened. That the Helical rising of Jupiter would have been on July 29th. A couple months later, Jesus is actually born. That's the woman clothed with the sun. The Magi continued to witness a spectacular display of the planet Jupiter, the star Regulus in the constellation of Leo for a little over a year. They saw a highly condensed series of events that all involved Jupiter Regulus in the constellation of Leo that told them that a great king had been born in Judea. But when we get to the stations of Jupiter, when they actually arrived at the court of Herod, this makes it even more stunning because, once again, like I said, we can use a computer and go to the exact date that they would have been doing this. And this makes complete sense because when the shepherds found a baby in a manger, but the Magi found a young child living in a house 15 months later. Okay, so the shepherds found a baby lying in a manger in September of 3 BC. The Magi came to Jerusalem in late December of 2 BC, and we know this because Herod was still alive, but in about 8 weeks, Herod's going to be dead. Okay, so Herod met with the Magi in late December, and Scripture tells us that Herod was greatly troubled and all Jerusalem with him. And this makes sense because that means the commotion that was raised by the arrival of the Magi and this, frankly, this army that came with them, the commotion occurred in late December. There was no commotion when Jesus was actually born in September over a year before, but there was a commotion in late December when the Magi arrived, which is why 200 years later, when people were trying to calculate the birth of Jesus Christ, they said, oh, it's got to be in late December. Turns out they were incorrect, but there's a good reason they were incorrect. It's because they were focusing on the arrival of the Magi. And the reason we know they arrived at that time is, number one, it's very highly probable that he was born during the Feast of Hanukkah. Or not born, I'm sorry, that they arrived during the Feast of Hanukkah, and that Jesus was actually conceived during the Feast of Hanukkah. But the stations of Jupiter would have occurred, and Jupiter would have stood over Bethlehem on December 27th and 28th of 2 BC. So the timing is perfect. So it's actually verifiable using celestial observation, and it all lines up, frankly, exactly the way you would expect it to once you know what to look for. So we're gonna wrap it up here with one last really significant point, which is that according to the Omen texts, when the heliacal rising of a planet would occur in the same sign as the rising sun, that meant that the omen was magnified. If the rising planet was in a different sign, in other words, the sign like right next to it, that the sun was in, but that the sun and the planet were in a different sign, then that omen meant nothing. That omen meant nothing. What is important is if the heliacal rising of the planet is in the same sign as the sun. And that occurred on July 29th of 3 BC when Jupiter was in its heliacal rising in conjunction with Regulus in Leo, which means to the Mesopotamian Magi, this would have grabbed their attention in a truly extraordinary way. Truly extraordinary way. And although mathematically that sign could have occurred approximately 3,000 years before, here we go, it is likely that this was unprecedented that this was the first time that humans actually witnessed the heliacal rising of Jupiter in conjunction with Regulus and Leo. And to put that all together, what that means is that throughout classical antiquity, Jupiter was known as the king planet, Regulus was known as the king star, and Leo was the royal sign. So this was an extraordinary celestial event that occurred that would have gotten the attention of the Babylonian Magi, the Mesopotamian Magi. And then one last thing is that if we translate this into Hebrew, okay, the planet Jupiter is called Tzedek in Hebrew. The star Regulus is Melech in Hebrew. And the Hebrews put great emphasis, ready for this, on puns. When you have words that sound alike, they consider that significant, right? So if you take these two words, Melech and Tzedek, and you squish them together, you get Melchizedek. And that is what they would have seen in the heliacal rising of the planet of Jupiter in conjunction with Regulus on July 29th of 3 BC.
What a fascinating hour with researcher Tim Keyes. Tim, what do you want to call this for the archive tonight?
Well, you could call this Ancient Texts of Babylon.
Oh, man, I love it. Now, I want you to tell me about your ministry. Any contact info you want to give out? And
sure.
Please, let us have that.
Absolutely. My ministry is called God Save the King. And God Save the King is my ongoing 35-year research project into what the nativity really would have looked like. The traditional nativity story, I don't mean to burst people's bubble, but I'm going to. The traditional nativity story is Christian mythology. The true nativity story only bears the vaguest resemblance to the traditional story, but the real story is much more fascinating and much more epic, and that's been my research project for 35 years. It is called God Save the King. My website is www.godsavetheking.org, and then I also have a YouTube channel and a Facebook page under those same labels, God Save the King.
Okay, before we jump to the next program, I've got one question to ask you. Are you familiar with a thing called the Flagstaff Stone?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay, I'm going to blow your mind with this. I'm going to send you an article later tonight, and this may give you some more ammo for your research. Very quickly,
yes, sir.
A number of years ago, I was introduced to a man named Dr. Jeffrey Goodman. He's an archaeologist, geologist, professional mining engineer. He studied with the Colorado School of Mines, and back in the 70s he was on a dig up in Flagstaff, Arizona, up on the mountainside. And they had been digging, and not much, but on the last day of the dig, at about 15 or 20 foot down, they uncovered this rock. And he describes it as a rock that looks like someone had put saran wrap over the top of it. It was like perfectly preserved, and it had these horizontal and vertical lines that are not created by nature. And he dated this thing with a carbon dating of over 10,000 years. Now, whether or not someone agrees on the dating, that's another story. But the reason I'm mentioning this to you is there is a magazine called the Plasticine Coalition News, and I'm going to send you a copy of it. I had him on this program. He's a Christian now, but at that time he was not. But he had these strange dreams. He's digging at so many feet, and he would find some object, and he said, and later it was God telling him ahead of time. He got out there, found the object, and he believes it's proof that, of course, the Native American people were here even as long ago as 10,000 years ago in North America. But all that aside, the reason I'm mentioning this to you is he said something that I was reminded of as you were talking tonight. You mentioned Venus. I said, so Dr. Goodman, what happened? He said, we found this stone. It's not supposed to be there. Not let alone down at that depth. And then, it's got like petroglyphs on there. I guess that's what you call. But I said, right. Well, what does it mean? And he said, it's an astronomical sign that ties in with Venus. I said, Venus? And he said some other things that I can't remember now. This was over 7-8 years ago. I've got the recordings, though. So the Bureau of Land Management shuts down the dig when they make the discovery. They confiscated his stone, and for about the next 25 years, they had it locked in a metal box. He went to the courts, and then just a few years ago, finally, after decades, got them to release it. He said, I just want to finish the research that we never got to do on it. He took it to the labs, and he published in the Plasticine Coalition Journal, and I featured this article in my magazine a few years ago. And all I can remember is he said to me that there was a person who had worked with Einstein. Goodman is Jewish. The other guy was Jewish too. He's a Christian believer now, Messianic Jew. And he said this guy looked at it and said, this is Venus. And then he said something about a fertility cycle, and I can't tell you any more than that. But I want to send this to you because when you were mentioning Venus and you were mentioning all the work you're doing, I said, I got to send you this. This may be a tip-off to something big. Not to mention, I'll get you in contact with Goodman. He wrote a book called The Comets of God. And I haven't heard from Jeffrey in about 7 years. I hope he's still alive. But he was an amazing man, and this blew my mind. Hey, by the way, Tim, I want to offer you an opportunity. Pray about it. I want you to get me an article and put it in Omegaman magazine. Since I talked to you last, we're coming back with a magazine, and I'd love to give you some space in there. Write a column, articles, any length you want, and we can advertise your ministry there. So pray about that, and if you'd like to do it, shoot me an article in Word, and we'll get it in the magazine.
Sounds good. I look forward to it.
I love this stuff you're talking about. Can we get you back on in May and continue your talks?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Do this for me. Get me a date that works for you. I'll work around your schedule, and let's get you back on, brother. What a fascinating show tonight. God bless you.
Yes, sir.
We'll see you soon.
God bless you.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Good night.